love to go wandering along the mountain track. And as I go, I love to sing my knapsack on my back. Marie,
Woods and Waters with your host, Bud Leavitt.
Well, you know, wouldn't be a complete season unless you come down out of Shin Pond, huh?
No.
You got to get you down once a year.
We're glad to hear your voice when you call.
Hadley Coolong is my program guest, and well, very honestly, we don't know what we're going to do we?
Not quite.
Uh-huh.
Not quite, Bud.
It's just like sitting down in front of the cabin and talking. What
That's
kind of
right.
a fall did you have?
Well, I had a pretty good fall, Bud.
Did you?
Yes, had a nice fall.
How about fishing? Did you do much fishing this year?
Well, I didn't do too much fishing this year, but I see some good fishing that they got up into the park, up into the Fowler ponds, and up in there. They got some good fishing up there.
Doesn't it always amaze you that those little ponds with all that pressure?
I know it.
Slaughter, and
That's right.
little slaughter, and big slaughter, and fowlers, and the rest of them.
Yeah.
Year in and year out, they still produce fish.
Produce fish, sure do. Yeah, and the tremendous amount of fishermen fishing every year there. You know, and they count on it. The minute the ice goes out, Fowler ponds, high and low, Long Pond, Billfish Pond, then Littlefield Pond.
In all the years you worked at the park, has anybody ever cataloged how many trout ponds there are within the park, within that 200,000 plus acres?
Well, I think they have. Offhand, I couldn't really tell you the figures, but I could take my shoe off and start counting, and there's a good number of them.
Yeah.
There's a good number of trout ponds up in there. The Russell Pond, Six Ponds, Traveler Pond, and yes.
Got to be
Bogey
50
Pond.
ponds or so within the
yes.
park
Yes.
that produce nothing but wild trout.
Well, nothing but a bunch of spring holes is about all they are, you know, and they're full of fish, and they've been fished there for generations.
How much has it slacked off since you first remember when you went into the park?
You mean fishing?
Yeah, I mean the size of the fish. Have they got smaller, or is it held up pretty good?
Yes, I think since I've been into the park, the fishing has been pretty much the same, but I can recall the first time I fished in the park, that is before it was in the park, into the Fowler ponds. The fish were, you got some pretty good fish, pretty sizable fish, 2.5 pound fish in big Fowler. And if you fished in there, back then it was 12 fish limit. And if you fished in there, you'd have a 30 of fish would be pound 3/4, 2 pounds, 2 pounds and a half. Mm-hmm. And now, about the only time you catch a good fish like that is toward the last of the season. You'll catch I saw one pretty near 3 pounds this past fall that a guy caught. He spends more time fishing there than anybody else, and he knows just about the time to be there to fish to catch the big fish. But Billfish Pond, I see 4.5 pound trout. Not many, but I've seen a few of them come out of there, and beautiful trout. That's got
Great
natural
color.
shrimps in there, you know.
Natural shrimp.
That's right.
Freshwater shrimp.
Freshwater shrimps. And it's a state trooper. I met a state trooper, a young fellow by the name of Smith. He was fishing in there, he and his boys, and they had this one trout, about 4.5 pounds. It was a beauty.
Pretty
So there's
fish.
a few good fish
Oh, sure.
still left.
But do you know why I dislike Fowler Pond, and
Why?
I have no desire of going back?
The hill,
No, the hill was navigable,
yeah.
but I was sleeping there one night on the ground, and we foolishly left our food very close to the tent.
Yeah.
And there got to be more bear in there
Oh, yes.
than anywhere in the
That's right.
world,
Yeah.
because they all gathered to eat off this fat boy who was sleeping in
That's
that
right.
tent.
That's right.
And one come over and nuzzled up to the tent and began to paw at it and so forth. And I won't say that I could smell his breath, but he was awful close.
Yeah.
But they stripped us of food.
Oh, sure.
What do you mean, oh, sure?
They do.
Do
They
that?
get more complaints about this and all.
We're in Fowler?
Oh, yes.
Listen, we never threw a light on, with another fellow and I. And, but from the tracks, they had to been, I'm going to say 4 or 5 bear
Yeah.
in that group.
Yeah.
And what a picnic they had on our groceries.
Yeah.
And we went out of there a couple of whipped dogs the next day and hungry till we get into Millinocket.
Yeah.
And of course I get into Donut Levex in there, an old donut, and I told him what happened, and he had a greater story to tell me in Millinocket than about the one that I had. But anyway, I never fell in love with Fowler after that.
Yeah.
Boy, there's a lot of bear in there.
Yeah. Well, them bears will stay there around. They'll stay there, and the fishermen will feed them and whatnot, or they'll take what they can get. Then they go over the hill and they go into South Branch.
Uh-huh.
And occasionally we have to take a box trap and go in there and trap them, because they get into the campground and they get to be real pest. And you got a lot of kids there and one thing or another. Now, the last one that they trapped out of South Branch Pond, he got up into the pickup truck. Keith would take and clean out the fire holes and the garbage and one thing or another to take down and throw in the dumpster. And he'd look, and the bear would be in the back end of the body. So he'd beat him out of there with a broom. And millions of pictures they took of him, you know.
Yeah.
And finally, he set the trap one night and got him in the box trap. And they took him up Masardis. They took him up where the watershed flows the other way. Because
How
if you
long was it before he got back?
He didn't. No,
He didn't?
won't. But they did take and catch one up there, and they caught him in Trout Brook. They brought him down here below Argyle and let him loose. In a week's time, he was back up there at the dumpster again, South Branch
That's
Pond.
why I thought this bear that they brought to Masardis would...
Now, the watershed going the other way, that will confuse them enough so that we haven't had any repeats by doing it that way.
But they dropped one in Argyle.
Yep, and back he went. Within a week's time, he was back up there to South Branch Pond in the barrel again, because they tag him each time they catch him, you know.
Boy, that's a distance overland. That's got to be 40, 50 miles somewhere in there.
That'll give you a pretty good idea how fast they travel.
I'll tell you, they traveled fast.
Yeah.
I was with Bud Cushing
Yeah.
one year at Harrington Pond. We were fishing down by that sand spit
Yeah,
down there.
yeah.
And we were doing very well. And if Bud's still here and hasn't gone south yet, he can verify this. And we saw this bear coming across Harrington, and Bud said, "You want to chase him?" And I said, "Well, I don't care, as long as you don't get too close to him." So we pulled up our lines, and I think he had a 9-horse on the canoe and so forth, and it would move pretty good.
Yeah.
But we couldn't gain on that
No, they
fella.
can swim.
And when it hit the beach, you talk about speed into that woods, it just absolutely disappeared.
Yeah.
Just disappeared.
Yeah. You ever know Bill Hall that used to guide up there?
Sure.
Well, Bill Hall had a set of camps up at Amaconcus Lake. And one time he was guiding this doctor, and they were fly fishing over on the shore of the lake, over near the south shore of the lake. And he looked and he saw a bear, and this bear had a cub. And the little cub kept going out into the water and swimming out and going back onto the beach, and the old she bear, she'd walk back and forth. She was watching him, you know. Well, they drifted in fairly close, and Bill was quite a joker anyway, you know, and he thought he'd have a little fun. He said to the doc, he said, "You watch, I'm going to catch that bear with a fly." And he said, "You are like hell." So he took his fly rod and he whipped her out that way, and he landed the fly just over the bear a little bit, and he pulled her back and he snagged him that time. And when he did, he rolled him over in the water. And of course, when he had him over in the water, he said to Doc, he said, "Pull that paddle and we'll get him out into the water." So he swung the canoe out that way, and the little fellow was hooked in the fur, you know. And Bill wound him right up the side of the canoe and grabbed him by the nape of the neck and throwed him in the canoe. And then he grabbed the paddle and they started for camp. Well, that old bear went halfway across that lake before she give in. And they got him in the camp. The little fellow was just, oh, heck, he wasn't very big, you know, just a little teeny wee bear. Well, he died the next day. the little bear died.
Huh.
And the old gent, he said to Bill, he said, I want you to skin that bear out. So he skinned the bear out, and when he went back, he took the bear hide with him. And Bill's daughter, that they have the camp at Jerry Pond now, she's 60 years old, 62 years old. She still has that little bear cub. They had it mounted and stuffed, a little teddy bear. And kind of a bad story to tell because
Well,
one.
they don't do those things
No,
nowadays.
no.
And
Well,
it-
he thought that he was going to, make a pet out of the bear after he got it in the canoe, But he said that the two of them laid on that paddle to keep ahead of that old she bear.
oh,
Because
boy.
she'd have come up the side of the gunnel on that and put a run in his stocking.
Yeah, I can see a run. You were in Fred Harrison's old diggings this summer at Hudson Pond.
Yeah.
You must have felt a little sad to make that visit.
Well, yes, I sure do, because that place has changed. The main camp has been burnt down, and the old gent not being there, it's quite a thing, because you used to see him a lot. You'd come into town, the first guy you'd see would be probably Harrison or Walker. They're both hermits, and you'd have a great time. He'd be willing to talk for a day or so, and then he'd clam up and put his pack on his back and go back to camp at Hudson Pond. And I enjoyed Fred. When he was sober, he was an awful nice guy, and he was an interesting guy. But when he was drinking, he was as mean as a cat. And I guess he got that from all the bobcat he caught. You ever at his camp at Hudson Pond?
Yeah.
If ever there was a dry place for a guy to live, that was it.
Oh, boy. Had that little pool out front
That's right.
with a few trout there.
Yep, yep.
You never touched those trout, or
No,
at least I never did.
No. I fished that pool with him one time. I didn't know it was there, and I stayed there overnight with him. He said, I'll take you fishing. Well, we talked, and it got dark, and I said, well, this fishing trip got over quick. But anyway, we were sitting in the camp, finally picked up a flashlight, and he said, you ready to go fishing? I said, with that flashlight? Yeah, follow me. So I followed him, and we went down through his catwalk, down through the swamp there, and out onto the ledge. And he had a couple of little sticks there, about little willow sticks with a junk of line on them. And he said, there's a can of worms over there with a rock on it. He said, bring them worms over here. I brought him over there, and he held that under his arm, and he baited that all up, and I said, now I wonder where we go from here. And went over about 5 from here to that can, shined the light down into the water that way, and there was a mass of trout there that long, with their heads right up against the rock, just like that. I said, I can't believe it. He'd throw that line in, out on the rock. He pulled out 3 or 4 trout. He said, how's that look to you? Fred, I said, I never see such fish in my life. We'll see that you don't tell anybody else.
Oh, boy, you bet.
And I could take you there and show you exactly the spot where he pulled in trout out there.
You have his moose sled.
I got his moose sled. Yeah, I got his moose sled. And I got the original fills that he had are there. You can see one place where it had cracked, and he wound it up with copper wire, reinforce it. And he had a tump line that went up over his neck to pull that, and those fills were to keep that sled from coming onto his snowshoes. Then he had there's a cedar block on the front end of that with a yoke made this way, where he'd take and put a log on it. When you tie a log on a sled, when it shifts its weight, the sled will tip over. It'll go off the snowshoe float and tip over. You can't hold it. It's got to be secured on there pretty good. And he'd take that log, probably 12, 13 feet long, put it on that sled and bind it down.
12 or 13 feet long?
Yeah, that's the way, I'd say about that long. He'd haul that.
God, Fred wasn't a very big man.
I know, but he'd, on a good hard snowshoe float, about all it was start the sled and she'd go, He'd get that down to the camp, start sawing off in the top end of her and work her back to the sled and unlash her and saw her up and go back after another one. And occasionally he'd go back after a piece of meat. He'd snowshoe moose down or a deer down, whatever he had to have. Graded them well. He didn't shoot,
You know, that's an old expression, and unless you're very familiar with our Maine, snowshoe the moose down. Explain that to our viewers. There may be some people out there don't understand that.
Well, you get back in that country, in the fall of the year, wintertime, moose yard up, and if you're going to get a piece of meat to live often, you just don't go in and, you go in and you pick it over. You got a young bull or a yearling or something like that there, that it's a choice eating of the flock. You go into that moose yard and start snowshoeing him down, and eventually you'll catch him out in he'll lunge break from the trail, and he'll lunge into the deep snow and go as far as he can go, and then he'll give up, and then you're not too far from him about that time, and you shoot him down and dress him out, jump
But they
him
never
up.
wasted, did they,
Oh,
Hadley?
no, they didn't waste any of them. And the only thing that they shot was when they needed it, and they, as I say, they wouldn't go in and shoot 2 or 3 and then say, I'll take this looks like the best one. They knew exactly what they were doing. And
I fished with a guide this summer, and I won't say where or his name, but a Maine guide, who was telling me about 1933. He said, times were tough.
yeah,
And my father was having a difficult time to feed us and to keep us warm and so forth. And he said, I don't mind telling you what we did in the fall of '33. I did as a kid. I helped him. He said, my father killed 9 deer just before the first heavy snowfall. And he said, I'll never forget the first day. He cleaned the deer all out and so forth. The first heavy snowfall came along, and boy, he put them there in a snowdrift back of the barn and let the snow cover them up.
yep.
Have you heard of this before?
I've heard it. They used to go down into the swamps, and they'd shoot a deer down in the swamps. And then if they could find an old cow shade of a spruce, they'd pull him up into that spruce. They'd dress him off, open him up. And then they'd take rope and get him up into the spruce, up under the boughs that way, and they'd leave him. And then they'd go another place, and maybe they'd shoot another one. If it was 2 or 3 they needed, this is where they'd cover him, see? And then during the wintertime, they'd take a sled like the sled I got from Harrison, and they'd go get him, put him on the sled, and come out through on the snowshoe float with him, and bring him out.
Well, this fellow was telling me we'd be short of meat, and that's all we ate.
Yeah.
He said we had 9 deer in the year 1933, and my father told me to go out and shovel off the snow off one of them, and of course it would be froze stiff right there in the ground, all refrigerated, the best in the world. And he'd either take an axe or a saw and cut a quarter off and bring it in the house, and that's how we ate.
That's right.
And he said, I'm not ashamed to tell that, but
No.
he said 1933 were tough times in our house.
Yeah.
And he told me that, and he said, I wouldn't even care if you wrote that. He said, it's the way we live.
Well, it was history.
It was history.
That's
That's
right.
exactly right. And he
right.
said, we never wasted a bit of it.
No.
We never wasted a bit of it. He said, my mother would use the neck for mincemeat and so forth, and but that's the way we ate.
Yeah.
We'd had 9 deer lined up under a snowdrift, and we'd go out with a shovel and pick one off and take off a quarter, and that's the way we ate.
Yeah.
There had to be a lot of that back
That's right.
then.
But they never, most of those guys, they didn't violate the law like with a flashlight
Oh, no.
back then. I mean, they didn't have to, because there was game enough during the daylight hours. They could go in there and shoot them, and they were damn good shots. I mean, they didn't slaughter a bunch of deer, wound a bunch of deer, because they were pretty close to the deer, and a lot of them old fellows, they were regular dead eyes. They could shoot the crematada right out of a biscuit.
Oh, I like that one. Put that one down in my book. Shoot the crematada right out of a biscuit. Tell me about your days of, speaking of biscuit, when you were cook for the Sherman Lumber Company.
Well, I went in there the day after Roy Dudley got killed.
Yeah, that was...
And that was 50 years ago. And I got a job working at their lumber camp, and the cook came from Patton, and he was pushing to promote me, and he wanted me to learn the cooking business, you know. And so I spent a lot of time in the cook room, him showing me how to prepare different things, you know. But then one thing I missed was I used to like to go out in the men's camp and listen to conversations out there, because there was a lot of conversations that were something to hear, you know. Some of those guys telling stories and one thing and another. And he'd come out and yard me back into the cook room again. And he'd say, "Your job's back here in the cook room." And there was 3 of us that were cookee in there in this camp, and he promoted me as head cookee. And my job was to take the food out of the utensils and get them ready so that they could take them from there and put them on the table. Well, I done this a good part of the winter, and I asked him, I said, I'd like to take the lunch out to the men. Well, he said, "That's the cookie's job." He said, "You're more important here." And I said, "Look, I tell you what, I'm either going to do this, I'm getting tired of this deal, or I'm going to go get a job in the crew." Well, he said, "All right." He said, "I'll let you go tomorrow." Well, they had a guy by the name of Campbell. He used to be a fire warden for 20 years up on Mount Chase. And he had one of the first cigarette rollers I ever seen. You take your tobacco out, you know, and you shake it up in that and roll them out. And take him 10 minutes or more to roll a cigarette. And it was the 10 minutes when you needed him when he'd roll one, you know. So I said, "Well, I'm going out to the lunch." And those roads, Bud, were all iced, and they were crowned up this way, so the sleds wouldn't leave the road. They'd slide down, you know, behind the tractors and the log haulers and trucks that were hauling them. So I got this great big sled that they had. They had a box on the front, and they had that full of cookies and donuts. Then they had a great big pail of hash and a great big pail of beans, and we had dippers and stuff, you know. And this sled had a set of fills on it too. So the guy got out and he started to roll a cigarette, and I told him, I said, "Get on the sled," and I said, there's about 1.5 miles, we get a free ride down the hill. And I said, "You can roll that cigarette while you're riding." "Oh, no." He said, "We won't do that." He said, "That's dangerous." He said, "We get killed with that sled." And I said, "Look, I'm a pro," I said, "at running a sled." Now, I said, "Let me give you a ride, Jimmy." Well, he rolled a cigarette, and he got that in his mouth, and he got a match, and he lit her up. And he got the rope around his wrist that way, and he put his feet up on the front, and he said, be awful careful. And so I pushed her as fast as I could push her, and I got on my knees behind that sled, and I started riding her. And boy, that thing was whipping time. She started down the hill, around the corner that way, and
Lake Placid, here I come.
Oh, we were really going, you know. And he was right out straight that way, and that cigarette was right up straight there, and the draft going right through her. So I got down around the next corner, and I looked, and there was a big Holt tractor coming, fellow by the name of Flynn. He had 10 set of sleds behind her. And I said, "Jimmy, jump off in that sled, roll off in that sled." So I'd rolled off when I saw it. You couldn't stop the sled. And he rode her for quite a ways before he bailed off on her. And that sled struck the lag of the tractor, and it just exploded. There was donuts that went 150 yards into the woods. And we had 60 men at noontime we had to feed. And the tractor sucked them beans right through the radiator that way and spit them right straight out into the woods for the birds. Well, I said, I see where my retirement comes up quick when I get back to the cook shack. But I cut a stick like you would put in a stringer fish, and I went through the woods, and those that weren't broke, I salvaged all the donuts and the cookies. And we went down and we boiled the cat, and we told the crew.
Did you ever see any more snow than you saw in 9/14? What year was that?
That was 1902, Bud. And
1902?
1902. I'm going to tell you a little story about that. We were splitting wood in 1940 at an old man by the name of Rowe. He owned a big store in Patton and become president of the bank there in Patton. And my father and I were splitting wood there, and we got the wood pile pretty well split up, and we had some blocks that we couldn't split, so we put a wedge in it, and we got the wedge stuck. And he said, "Go in the barn and see if you can find another wedge." Well, I went in and looked around, and I couldn't find one, so he went in, and he started looking around. And all of a sudden, he looked up on the wall of the barn, and there was a pair of snowshoes like that there hanging on the wall. He said, I can't find the wedge, but he said, you know what I found? I said, what? He said, my snowshoes. He said, that old man used to come home at noontime. He used to have a great big fur coat that he used to wear, you know, and he didn't have a car. He used to walk from the store up home. So when he arrived there at noontime, we asked him where the wedge was, and he said, behind the door down in the side there. The father said, Henry, he said, one thing I see in that barn, he said, a pair of snowshoes. He said, tell us, them are your snowshoes. He said, I know they are. He said, you remember when you lent them to me? 38 years ago, up at 914. They were working up in the woods that winter, and the snow come. There was about 13 feet of snow that hit up that country, up near Russell Pond. And they, my father and another fella, they shot deer in the deer yard to feed the crew, and they shot the horses because they had no hay to feed them. And this old gent, and he and 3 or 4 other guys decided they were going to head for Patton. And he had no snowshoes, so my father gave him no snowshoes. He said, I'll loan you a pair of snowshoes, Henry, if you think you can make it. I don't think you can make it, because it's one hell of a journey. That's just southeast of Ross Lake. And from there to Patton was quite a ways. And the old boy made it. He walked out from there. He said he pretty near died. And he hung those shoes up, and every now and then he'd say, I got to take them back to Mr. Coolong. 38 years they hung there. And the old boy got his snowshoes back. And that was the year that they figured one of the largest storms that they ever had hit that part of the country, about 13 feet.
Hadley, we've been talking for 28 minutes and 50 seconds, and it's been great fun. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, bud.
Let's do it again sometime.
That's right.
Good night, everyone.
The mountain track, and as I go and out to sing, my knapsack on my back, Valerie, dances in the sun, so joyously it calls to me, come join my happy song.